You've seen the Taj Mahal 1,000 times, in photos, in movies, on someone's desktop wallpaper, that white dome glowing at sunrise like it was carved out of light itself. You know the story. An emperor. A wife he loved so much he built her a tomb that took 22 years and thousands of hands. But here's what almost nobody tells you. Somewhere underneath that white marble, there are rooms. Real rooms. 22 of them. And for longer than your grandfather has been alive, no one outside a small circle of officials has been allowed to walk into them. Not historians, not journalists, not the millions of tourists who pass within a few feet of the doors every single year. Just locked, sealed, quiet. And every time someone has asked why, really asked, pushed hard enough to get an answer, the answer has changed. To understand why those rooms matter, you have to go back. Not to the building, to the man. His name, before the world gave him a bigger one, was Khurram. Born in 1592, third son of an emperor, which in the Mughal court meant something specific and brutal. It meant you were disposable until proven otherwise. Sons didn't inherit thrones by birth order in that world. They inherited them by outliving, outmaneuvering, and sometimes outright killing their brothers. At 19, he met a girl. Her name was Arjuman Banu. History would later call her Mumtaz Mahal, the jewel of the palace. But that name came after, a title bestowed once she'd already become something rarer than a title could hold. They were engaged for 5 years before they married, which in that century, in that court, was almost unheard of. Marriages were alliances. This one, by every account that survives, was something else. Khurram had other wives, political ones, necessary ones. With them, across his entire life, he fathered one child. With Mumtaz alone, he had 14. Sit with that number for a second. 14 children in 19 years of marriage, in an era when childbirth itself was closer to a battlefield than a beginning. Half of those children didn't survive infancy. That was ordinary then. Tragically, statistically ordinary. What wasn't ordinary was that Mumtaz herself rode beside her husband into military campaigns, sat in on matters of state, was trusted with things wives of convenience never were. By 1631, Khurram had become Shah Jahan, king of the world. He had the throne he was born to fight for. He had, by every measure available to a 17th century emperor, everything. Then Mumtaz went into labor with their 14th child in a military camp near Burhanpur, far from the marble and the gardens of home. Something went wrong. The bleeding wouldn't stop. She died within hours. The accounts from that period, and there are many because Mughal emperors were obsessive about recording their own history, describe a man who didn't recover in any normal sense of the word. He disappeared from public life for a year. When he reappeared, witnesses wrote that his hair had gone white, that his back had bent, like something inside him had physically collapsed under the weight of it. This was a man who commanded armies, who held the fate of tens of millions of people in his hands, and grief broke him the way it breaks anyone. In Islamic belief, the grave isn't an ending, it's a waiting room. The body returns to soil, but the soul stays there, tethered to that place until judgment comes. Which means where you bury someone isn't just where you say goodbye, it's where their soul will wait, for however long waiting lasts. Shah Jahan decided his wife would not wait in an ordinary place. He commissioned the greatest architect he had access to, a man named Ustad Ahmad Lahori, who would later be given the title Wonder of the Age. He pulled in artisans from wherever the skill existed, calligraphers from Persia, stone carvers from Bukhara in modern Uzbekistan, masons from Baluchistan. He sent for materials the way other kings sent armies. White marble hauled from Rajasthan over 200 miles on the backs of more than 1,000 elephants. Jade and crystal from China, turquoise from Tibet, sapphire from Sri Lanka. 28 different types of precious and semi-precious stone, cut and inlaid by hand into marble so pale it seems to hold its own light. It took 22 years. 22,000 workers by most estimates, moving through that site every single day for over 2 decades. Masons, gem cutters, calligraphers, laborers, who did nothing but haul stone from dawn until they couldn't stand. And this is where the story most people know ends. A grieving king. A monument to a woman he couldn't let go of. Beautiful, tragic, complete. Except it isn't complete, because underneath everything you just heard, underneath the love story, underneath the 22 years of labor, there's a structural fact almost no documentary bothers to mention. The Taj Mahal isn't just a building sitting on the ground. It's a building sitting on top of something else. A foundation of wells, and beneath those wells, corridors, rooms, an entire lower level running underneath the platform the tomb stands on. Built at the same time, by the same hands, for reasons the official record never fully explains. And that lower level is exactly where this story starts to get complicated. Here's what's verifiable, not theory, not rumor. Fact on the record from the people who maintain the building. Beneath the main platform of the Taj Mahal, there are 22 rooms. Some sources describe them less as separate rooms and more as a long corridor with chambers branching off it. But either way, the number that keeps surfacing again and again across a century of records is 22. The same number as the years it took to build the place above them. For most of that time, those rooms have been locked. Not abandoned, not forgotten. Locked, with keys, with guards, with a level of intentional restriction that doesn't match how the rest of the monument is treated. You can walk through nearly every other part of the Taj Mahal complex. You can stand inches from the cenotaphs of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal themselves. But those 22 rooms below the platform stay shut, and for most of modern history, almost no one outside a small circle of Indian government officials has been allowed inside to see what's there. Now, if you're the kind of person who spent any time reading about how governments handle inconvenient questions, you already know what happens next. Someone asks why, and the answer they get depends entirely on who's asking and when. In 2015, a group of lawyers filed a petition in an Indian court demanding the rooms be open. Their claim wasn't subtle. They argued the Taj Mahal wasn't originally a tomb at all, but a far older Hindu temple, seized and repurposed by the Mughal emperor. A few years later, in 2022, a politician filed a nearly identical petition asking the Archaeological Survey of India, the government body responsible for the site, to form a special committee and formally investigate what, if anything, was hidden in those closed doors. Specifically, whether there were idols of Hindu gods sealed inside. The court dismissed that petition, called it in essence a waste of judicial time, built on no legal foundation. But here's the part that should make you pause. Dismissing a petition isn't the same as answering a question. A court can throw out a legal claim because it doesn't meet the bar for a lawsuit. That tells you nothing about what's physically behind those doors. It just tells you a judge didn't think this particular argument, filed this particular way, deserved a trial. So the Archaeological Survey of India did something almost unheard of for that organization. They released photographs, publicly, images of the interior of those sealed rooms, bare walls, restoration work in progress, dust and scaffolding, nothing that looked remotely like a temple. Officials went on record saying the rooms were closed not to hide anything, but because there was, in their words, nothing worth showing tourists, that the space was structural, load-bearing, part of the architecture keeping the entire monument standing on ground that sits dangerously close to the Yamuna River. That explanation is plausible. It's also notably exactly what an official would say, whether it was true or not. And this is where you have to sit with something uncomfortable, something this audience understands better than most. The absence of proof isn't the same as proof of absence. The photographs the ASI released don't prove nothing else exists down there. They prove that in the specific rooms they chose to photograph, on the specific day they chose to do it, nothing unusual was visible to the camera. A locked space, cleaned and curated before the cameras arrive, tells you what the people controlling access want you to see. It doesn't tell you what came before. It doesn't tell you what was there in 1631, when the first stone of that foundation went into the ground. Because here's the detail almost no one talks about. Before Shah Jahan ever broke ground on his wife's tomb, that land already belonged to someone, a Rajput nobleman named Raja Jai Singh. And the way that land changed hands, from a Hindu ruler's family to a Mughal emperor, in the exact years construction began, is the loose thread that an entire alternate history of the Taj Mahal has been pulled from ever since. Some call it a conspiracy theory. Some call it a suppressed truth. What it actually is more interesting than either label. And it starts with a man who spent his life trying to prove that almost every famous building on Earth used to be Hindu. His name was Purushottam Nagesh Oak. And before you picture some fringe figure shouting into the void, understand this. P.N. Oak wasn't a nobody. He'd worked for the Indian government. He'd served in the military. He had the credentials, the confidence, and the platform to make people listen. What he didn't have was a historian's training or a historian's discipline. And the difference between those two things is where this whole story turns. Real historical research is slow, unglamorous work. You go through court records, foreign travelers' journals, tax documents, correspondence, construction ledgers, and you cross-reference every claim against multiple independent sources before you write a single sentence you're willing to defend. It's tedious. It's humbling. Most of what you find contradicts what you hope to find, and you have to follow the contradiction anyway. Oak's method was almost the opposite. He'd start with a conclusion, usually some version of "this was originally Hindu," and then work backward, looking for anything that could be twisted to fit. His favorite tool was sound. If a word in one language sounded a little like a word in Sanskrit, that was, to him, evidence. Not a curiosity, evidence. He claimed the Vatican was originally a Hindu temple because Vatican sounded a little like Vatica, a Sanskrit word for garden. He claimed Westminster Abbey had Hindu origins. He wrote that Christianity itself descended from the worship of Krishna, because, he argued, Christianity was actually a corruption of Krishna Nidhi, and that Jesus had traveled to India as a young man and studied under Hindu teachers before returning west with a borrowed philosophy. He claimed the biblical Abraham was a linguistic descendant of Brahma, that Abraham's wife, Sarah, was really Saraswati, that Moses was Shiva, misremembered. By the time he got to the Taj Mahal, this was a well-worn habit, not a new idea. He argued the entire monument was never built by Shah Jahan at all, that it had originally been a Hindu temple called Taj Mahal, built centuries before the Mughals ever set foot in India, and that Shah Jahan had simply seized it, stripped away the evidence of its origin, and rebranded another civilization's sacred architecture as his own grief. Here's the detail that should catch your attention, though, because it's the one that keeps this theory alive even among people who've never read a word Oak wrote. He didn't invent the land transfer. That part is real. There actually was a Rajput noble family with property on that exact site before construction began. Records do show the land changed hands. Oak took one true documented fact, a real estate transaction 700 years ago, and built an entire alternate civilization's history on top of it, filling every gap with certainty he had no right to. And when historians pushed back, pointing out that no archaeological evidence of any Hindu temple had ever been found beneath or around the Taj Mahal, no foundation stones, no inscriptions, no idols, nothing in the extensive Mughal court records that obsessively documented nearly everything else about the emperor's life. Oak simply revised the claim. First, he said the temple was ancient, predating recorded history. When that didn't hold up, he moved the date forward, claiming a specific 13th century king built it. When even that timeline stopped making sense against the documented dates of the Taj Mahal's actual construction, he adjusted it again. Notice what's happening there. A real historian, confronted with evidence that contradicts a theory, abandons or revises the theory to match the evidence. Oak did the opposite. He kept the conclusion fixed and kept sanding down the evidence until it fit, which is the exact inversion of how truth is supposed to work. And it's worth remembering the next time somebody hands you a story that already knows its own ending before it's finished the investigation. In 1989, he published all of it in a book, Taj Mahal, The True Story. A decade later, he took his claims to India's Supreme Court, demanding the site be excavated to prove him right. The court didn't just dismiss the case. The way they dismissed it tells you almost everything about how seriously his methodology was taken by anyone whose job was to actually verify facts for a living. The judges called his theory a wild goose chase. One justice reportedly remarked that Oak seemed to have been bitten by a bee, a very polite, very devastating way of saying, "We are not spending the court's time on this. Case closed, theory dead." Except it wasn't. Because here's what nobody in that courtroom could have predicted in the year 2000. The thing that was about to happen to information itself, everywhere, all at once. A few years later, smartphones arrived, then messaging apps, then the specific, strange phenomenon that people in India now call, half joking and half serious, WhatsApp University. The endless forwarding of claims, screenshots, and half-remembered history through family group chats, with no editor, no fact check, no friction between a claim and a million phones. Oak's dead theory found new life there, not because anyone rediscovered his original research. Almost nobody reads a 1989 self-published pamphlet. What spread instead was the conclusion, stripped of the method, the Taj Mahal was really a Hindu temple, forwarded and re-forwarded until it stopped feeling like one man's discredited claim and started feeling like something everybody sort of already knew. That's how a theory survives its own autopsy. Not through evidence, through repetition. And repetition is powerful. It doesn't need to be true to work. It just needs to be said enough times, by enough people you trust, that doubting it starts to feel like the unusual position, instead of the other way around. By 2015, new lawsuits were filed, almost word for word echoing Oak's discredited claims, as if the Supreme Court ruling 15 years earlier had simply never happened. By 2022, a sitting politician filed another petition, again demanding the 22 rooms be forced open, again citing the temple theory as though it were an open question rather than a closed one. Here's what should genuinely interest you about that pattern, because it's not really a story about the Taj Mahal at all. It's a story about how doubt gets manufactured and remanufactured generation after generation, long after the facts have been settled. A claim doesn't need new evidence to come back. It just needs a new audience who hasn't heard the old rebuttal yet. So where does that leave the actual mystery? Because underneath all the noise, underneath Oak, underneath the lawsuits, underneath WhatsApp University, there are things about the Taj Mahal that are genuinely, verifiably strange. Not invented, documented, and it's worth separating those from the noise, because they're far more interesting than a debunked conspiracy theory, and they don't require anyone to have lied about anything. Walk the main pathway toward the tomb, and something happens to your eyes that architects still study today. As you approach, the building appears to recede, to get farther away the closer you walk. It's not a trick of the light. It's a deliberate optical illusion, built into the proportions of the walkway and the building's scale, engineered 400 years ago by people who understood how the human eye misjudges distance against a symmetrical vanishing point. Nobody had to hide that. It was hidden in plain sight, in the math. Look up at the 4 minarets flanking the main dome, and you'll notice, if you know to look, that they don't stand perfectly straight. They lean, slightly, deliberately outward, away from the tomb at their center. That's not a construction flaw 4 centuries old. It's insurance. If an earthquake ever brought them down, they were designed to fall outward, away from the tomb, protecting the one thing the entire structure exists to protect, even in collapse. A 400-year-old contingency plan built into stone for a disaster that, as far as we know, never came. And on the far bank of the river behind the Taj Mahal, there's a garden called Mahtab Bagh, the Moonlight Garden. Local legend holds that Shah Jahan intended to build himself a second tomb there, a mirror image of his wife's, but built entirely from black marble instead of white. His own resting place facing hers across the water, connected by a bridge, so that even in death they'd remain in sight of each other. He never got the chance to build it. He never got the chance because the man who stopped him was his own son. Shah Jahan had 4 sons who survived to adulthood, and in the Mughal world, that number was never going to end peacefully. It never had in any generation before his. The throne didn't pass by agreement. It passed by war, and the war for Shah Jahan's throne began before he was even dead. The moment his sons realized their father was aging, and that the empire he'd built would belong to whoever moved first and moved hardest. The son who moved first was named Aurangzeb, and Aurangzeb understood something his father either didn't see coming or refused to see coming, which might be the crueler possibility. He understood that a black Taj Mahal, a second monument mirroring the first, built purely from grief and love with no strategic purpose whatsoever, would drain a treasury that Aurangzeb believed belonged to the empire, not to his father's private mourning. So before that second tomb could rise, Aurangzeb moved. He seized the throne, and he didn't kill his father. That would have been too clean, too final, almost merciful by comparison. Instead, he had Shah Jahan arrested and imprisoned inside the Agra fort in a tower known as the Musamman Burj, close enough to see the Taj Mahal in the distance from his window, close enough to look at it every single day for the rest of his life and never be allowed to walk inside it again. Sit with that for a second, because it's the kind of detail that doesn't need embellishment. A man builds the most extravagant monument to love in human history, and he spends his final years imprisoned by his own child, staring at it from a window he cannot leave, watching the marble catch the light every morning and every evening, close enough to see every detail, too far to ever touch it again. He died there in 1666, and this is where the story quietly loops back to those 22 locked rooms beneath the platform. Because according to several historical accounts, when Shah Jahan died, his body wasn't carried to the Taj Mahal through the main gates, the way you or I would walk in today as tourists. It was moved through a different route entirely. Some records describe his daughters transporting his body through what's described as a secret underground passage, a tunnel connecting the Agra fort directly to the Taj Mahal complex, running beneath the riverbank, emerging somewhere near the base of the very platform those sealed rooms sit under. Whether that specific tunnel still exists intact today, whether it connects to the same rooms that remain locked now, is one of those questions that sits in the gap between documented history and the parts of this story the Archaeological Survey of India has never fully opened for outside verification. The tunnel is mentioned. The entrance point at the fort is identified, marked, even shown to visitors on some tours. What lies at the other end, the exact relationship between that passage and the 22 rooms beneath the tomb, has never been independently documented for the public. Here's what should actually unsettle you about that, more than any conspiracy theory Oak ever invented. You don't need a fabricated Hindu temple to have a real mystery on your hands. You just need a 400-year-old underground passage connecting a political prison to the base of the world's most famous monument to love that no outside historian has been allowed to fully map. Shah Jahan was buried finally in that mausoleum, beside the wife he'd spent 35 years mourning by the time he joined her. His grave sits slightly off-center from hers, the only asymmetrical element in an otherwise perfectly symmetrical building, because it was never meant to be there. Mumtaz's tomb was the design. His was an addition, made necessary by the same son who imprisoned him, the only piece of the Taj Mahal that wasn't planned, forced into a structure built entirely around balance. Even in death, he broke the one rule the building was built to keep. And underneath both of them, underneath the marble, underneath the cenotaphs tourists photograph by the millions every year, those 22 rooms are still there, still locked, still connected, by legend if not by confirmed fact, to a tunnel that once carried an emperor's body home in secret, under cover of darkness, away from the eyes of the empire that had just taken everything else from him. If you're still here with me, this deep into it, I want to say something and then get right back to where we left off. If this is the kind of story you find yourself thinking about later, when you're doing something completely unrelated and it just surfaces again, the tunnel, the rooms, the son who imprisoned his own father within sight of the thing he built, that's not an accident. That's the difference between history that gets memorized and history that actually means something to you. And if you want more of that, week after week, this channel is where I put it. Subscribing costs you nothing, and it means these stories keep finding you instead of you having to go looking for them. All right, back to it. Because there's one more layer to this, and it's the one that actually connects everything you've heard so far. The grief, the theory, the locked rooms, the tunnel. It's the question almost nobody asks, because it doesn't fit the postcard version of the story. Who actually built the Taj Mahal? Not the emperor who commissioned it, the hands. You've heard the number by now. 22,000 workers over 22 years. What you probably haven't heard is the myth that grew up around them and why that myth exists at all. The claim goes like this. Once construction finished, Shah Jahan ordered the hands of every worker cut off. All 22,000 of them, so that nothing as beautiful as the Taj Mahal could ever be built again. So his monument would remain permanently unrepeatable, the single greatest thing human hands had ever made. It's a chilling image. It's also almost certainly false, and the reasons why matter more than the myth itself. Think through the logistics for a second, the way this audience tends to think through things. 22,000 people. Cutting off that many hands isn't a decree. It's a massive, coordinated, brutal operation, requiring executioners, medical intervention to prevent every single one of those workers from simply bleeding to death, and a level of infrastructure that would have to appear in someone's records. Court historians of that era wrote down everything. Court expenditures, construction timelines, diplomatic correspondence, even minor scandals. Foreign travelers passed through the region constantly and wrote detailed journals about what they saw. Not one of them, not a single contemporary account, from inside the empire or outside it, mentions this happening. No mass graves of severed hands have ever been found. No skeletal evidence, nothing. And here's the detail that actually kills the myth outright, if you know where to look. After the Taj Mahal was completed, those same workers, the masons, the calligraphers, the gem cutters, the stone carvers, didn't disappear. Many of them settled permanently in a district of Agra called Taj Ganj, built specifically to house them during construction. Their descendants still live there today, still practice the same trades generations later. Marble inlay work, the same technique used on the tomb itself, still made by hand, still sold to tourists walking those same streets. You cannot inlay marble with hands that were cut off 4 centuries ago and passed down through bloodlines that never existed. More than that, those same craftsmen went on to build an entirely new city, Shah Jahanabad. You know it today by a different name: Old Delhi, the Red Fort, the Jama Masjid. Some of the Mughal Empire's most extraordinary architecture, constructed by the very people this myth claims were mutilated into permanent silence in the years immediately following the Taj Mahal's completion. So where does a myth like that come from? If none of it holds up, probably the same place most myths like it come from. Grief this large, wealth this obscene, beauty this deliberate, it doesn't sit comfortably with people. Something in us wants there to be a cost, a darker story underneath the beautiful one, because beauty this total, built by one man's private sorrow, feels like it should have required a sacrifice bigger than money and time. The severed hand story gives that sacrifice a shape. It's not history, it's the human need for consequence, dressed up as history, repeated so often across so many generations that it now competes with the truth in the exact same way Oak's temple theory does. Which brings you back to where this entire story keeps circling. 2 theories, both false, both persistent, one claiming the Taj Mahal was stolen, the other claiming it was paid for in unforgivable cruelty. Both wrong, both still alive right now, in group chats and comment sections and half-remembered conversations, because false stories don't need evidence to survive. They only need to feel true to enough people for long enough that no one thinks to check anymore. What's actually true is stranger and somehow harder to let go of once you know it. So here's where you actually stand after all of it. You started this video knowing one story about the Taj Mahal, a king, a wife, a tomb, love carved into marble. That story is still true. It hasn't been taken from you, but it was never the whole building. Underneath it, there was a man who was disposable until he wasn't, who fought his way to a throne he then nearly abandoned for a year of unbroken grief, who spent a fortune and 2 decades and 22,000 pairs of hands trying to build something that would outlast his own memory of the woman he lost, and then spent his final years imprisoned by his own son, close enough to see it every morning, never close enough to walk through its doors again. Underneath that, there's a piece of land that once belonged to someone else, and a man named Oak, who took that one true fact and built an entire false civilization on top of it. Not because the evidence led him there, but because he'd already decided where he was going before he ever looked. And underneath all of that, literally, physically underneath the marble you'd stand on if you visited tomorrow, there are 22 rooms that have stayed locked for longer than most of us have been alive. Rooms the government says are empty. Rooms a discredited theory says are hiding a stolen temple. Rooms that a dead emperor's body may have passed beneath, one last time, through a tunnel nobody outside a small circle has ever been allowed to fully map. Maybe there's nothing down there. Maybe the Archaeological Survey of India is telling you exactly the truth, and those rooms are just what keeps a 400-year-old building standing on unstable ground beside a river. Or maybe the reason a government keeps a door locked isn't always the reason it gives you. Either way, you know something now that most people watching a highlight reel of the Taj Mahal never learn. You know the cost had a shape. You know the myths had a birthplace. And you know that the most beautiful thing one man ever built for another person was also, quietly, the place where he ended up a prisoner, watching it from a window for the rest of his life, unable to go home. That's not a moral. It's just what happened. Make of it what you will. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't the kind of channel that's going anywhere. New stories like this one, every week. The parts of history that get left out of the postcard. Subscribing keeps you in that loop. And if this one actually got under your skin a little, send it to 5 people who'd sit through all 45 minutes with you. Not everyone shares that. Some people do. Leave a comment, a real one. Tell me what stuck with you. And if there's a place, a building, a story you've always wondered about but never found the full truth of, tell me. That might be exactly what we go looking for next.